Be with those in Texas, Lord, who lost their children, who lost their parents, the grandparents, Lord. I pray you give them comfort. I pray you be with this meeting, Lord, and let the contents be good, and that it all be for your glory. In Christ's name I do pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, so we're going to get right into this. This is obviously a learning session for all of us. I know I'm looking forward to this presentation, so without further ado, I'm going to welcome Mr. Carson Bice to begin the presentation. Then we'll have a question and answer session shortly after. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Carson Bice.
That work?
Does that work?
That
There
works,
we go.
yeah.
There we go. I'm Carson Bice.
Point of procedure, Mr. Chairman.
Mhm.
Back in the budget deliberations, we had talked about putting off the UDO. My concern is what's happening with the UDO? Why is this before the UDO? Was the council considering the UDO that we've already spent $400,000 on? Why are we doing it right now and not what the people asked for?
No, if this is even.
Oh, test.
So this workshop. Thank you, sir. This better? This workshop was actually set up prior to when the impact fee the study was actually brought forward before it was held. So it was really set up to, if it were to pass, we could begin the process to get prepared for the study. And since it was held, I figured this was still a good opportunity to learn about the impact fees, especially for South Carolina, and just to give council and the Planning Commission a good idea of what they are and how they would operate and how we'd move forward.
Right, but what does that have to do with the UDO that we had put on hold as a procedure that is pending right now, that we are not even discussing at all? Isn't that more important for the overall development of the county? Then while impact fees may be a good tool, where's the UDO?
Well, it's scheduled to come back up based on our last committee of the whole meeting where we said we would take it up in either July or August, I believe, when we were talking about it.
And this is with all due respect to the speaker, I didn't want to do this, but it's July.
Well, I would just suggest maybe next time to give
The
me
excuse that was told to all the public and to all of us council was that we couldn't deal with it because we were too busy with the budget. Right? Now we passed the budget. Where is it? Where's the UDO?
It's still sitting at the same place it was when we discussed it last time.
Why are we not considering it like we told everybody we were going to? I understand.
Because this has
Right.
This is
That's
not
my
the
point.
UDO discussion, so let's get back to the
That is
discussion.
my point. Thank you. That's just my
Mhm.
point.
Thank you.
We're
Welcome,
ready?
Mr. Bice.
I'm Carson Bice, President of Tischler Bice. My pleasure to talk to you about impact fees, my favorite thing to talk about. It's going to be kind of like drinking from a fire hose, so let's keep it real informal. Let's don't save questions to the end. If you've got a question on one of the slides I'm on, let's go ahead and ask it, because I think it'll sort of illuminate some of the slides that then follow. So a little bit about us. We're based in Bethesda, Maryland and Boise, Idaho, and we have a unique specialty focusing on cost of growth related issues. We're known for two things, primarily impact fees, as well as fiscal and economic impact analysis, and we've done more of this type of work than any firm in the country. We also do a lot of capital improvement planning, infrastructure financing strategies, et cetera. We've done a considerable amount of impact fee work in the state of South Carolina, and this is all of our previous or existing impact fee clients in the state. Now, it may surprise you to find out that regardless of what state we're in the country, most local governments don't have a lot of tools available to them to fund infrastructure. And the primary ways that we fund infrastructure in this country is from broad-based revenues, and that depends on the local government revenue structure in that particular state, whether you're property tax based or sales tax based or income tax or a combination thereof. We have gas taxes available. A lot of communities we work with out west, like in Colorado and California and Arizona, use forms of special assessment districts. They all have different names, like metro districts, community improvement districts, et cetera, but they're all the same thing. This country historically, particularly the 60s, 70s, and parts of the 80s, relied heavily on state and federal sources, and most recently with all the COVID-related, ARPA money, and that once again the federal government has stepped in and done a lot as it relates to funding infrastructure. Gaining in popularity are what we call P3s, or public-private partnerships. Toll roads are getting more and more popular in the country. Pioneering agreements, which is essentially where you enter into an agreement with the development community, and they basically become your banker, and you pay them back through different agreements and revenue sources, whether it's general taxes or special assessments or impact fees. And then a lot of the infrastructure in this country is funded through the exaction process that is typically enabled through your subdivision regulations, whether it's getting dedications for road improvements, getting dedications for land, for parks, dedications of land for fire stations, et cetera. And then otherwise, if we don't fund our infrastructure, then essentially as a community, we are going to generally accept lower levels of service. And frankly, most of the jurisdictions we work with around the country have historically seen their levels of service decrease over time as more and more unfunded mandates have been foisted upon them, and there's been a resistance to raise property taxes and sales taxes, et cetera. And so most communities we work with, levels of service are not as high as they were 20 or 30 years ago. So let's talk about impact fees in general. They are a one-time payment. They're designed to offset new developments' impact on different infrastructure categories or infrastructure systems. We can't use them for operations, maintenance, or general replacement of infrastructure. We can't commingle the impact fees into our general fund. We have to account for them separately. And it's not a tax. And the reason I say that is because I can't tell you how many jurisdictions I've been in front of where somebody on the council or the planning commission or some audience member from the general public will say, this is just a tax on new development. And it's important in my mind that we distinguish between a tax and a fee. A tax is primarily revenue raising in nature. A lot of times we have to go to the voters to get approval for a tax. There's no connection between how much revenue is generated in a tax versus how much you consume in services or infrastructure. So it's a broad-based revenue sources. A fee is typically designed to cover the cost of something. So when the county sets its building permit rates or its subdivision review rates or site plan review rates, et cetera, typically those are designed to cover the direct and indirect costs of performing that service. And with impact fees, it's an even stricter test. We have to meet 3 prongs of a legal test. We have to show, through the study, we have to show need or nexus, right? That new development is occurring in Greenville County, that growth is going to continue, and as a result of that, if we want to maintain current levels of service, we're going to have to make system-level improvements. And it's very important to differentiate between system-level improvements and project-level improvements. Project-level improvements are those exactions I talked about earlier, where a lot of communities we work with may have a requirement that you dedicate a neighborhood or land for a neighborhood park, but you still pay a park impact fee for those community and regional parks and athletic facilities that are serving the community at large versus the community just within your subdivision, right? So it's important that it's system improvements, not project level. We also have to show benefit, and we show benefit in 2 ways. One is through the timing of the expenditure, and many impact fee acts, South Carolina included, which we'll go into here in a few slides, have requirements or stipulations on how soon you have to spend the money. Other states don't. You just have to spend the money within a reasonable time, and usually that's accepted to be 7 to 10 years. So the idea here is that I paid you an impact fee, and county, you now have to provide infrastructure in a timely fashion from which I'll benefit. The second part of benefit relates to geography. And if Greenville County were to consider impact fees, you'd probably have to get into benefit areas for some of the fees. And the idea here is that we're not collecting money, let's say, in the north to build schools in the south, for instance, if we were talking about a school district, or money in the north and spending all that money in the south to build roads, right? In cities, it's not as complicated because typically cities are smaller and you're providing things or providing infrastructure on a citywide level of service, and so typically we don't have to get into that, but sometimes we do in large or cities with large geographies as well as counties. And then finally, we have to make sure the fees are proportionate. And that's why you don't have just a residential fee versus a non-residential fee. You have it by type of unit or size of unit, because typically in most communities, the demography suggests that on average, a single-family house has more people in it than a multifamily unit. Conversely, retail, for instance, generates more vehicle trips per 1,000 square feet than office does. Office generates more trips than industrial. Office has more employees than retail. Office has more employees than industrial. So we have to make sure the fees are commensurate with that demand, which is why at a minimum you have single family versus multifamily, and typically you have several non-residential categories. At a minimum you would have retail, office, industrial, maybe institutional uses or medical uses, et cetera. So impact fees, the math is pretty simple. It's all the machinations that go on behind the scenes, the discussions from the policy perspective, et cetera, that make the fees time consuming, and also the public process adds to the cost. But it's pretty simple. The first thing you do is you define the number of demand units by type of development. And by demand unit, we mean, for instance, for parks. What's the demand for parks? It's people. What's the demand for roads? It's usually vehicle trips or vehicle miles of travel. And so we define what the demand units are by type of development, and then we figure out the number of infrastructure units per demand unit. And so what that means is, in simple terms, and I'll use parks as an example for a lot of these because it's simpler to understand. You know, most parks and rec master plans have some sort of adopted or goal level of service, and we're going to provide a level of service of 5 acres per 1,000, right? So that's what we mean by infrastructure units. So the master plan may say 5 acres per person, but if we look at what you have in the ground today, it may be 3.6 acres per 1,000. So that's what we mean by infrastructure units. So we've got 3.6 acres per 1,000. So we figure out, well, what does that mean per person? And then we figure out, well, what does it cost to buy an acre of land? Is it $50,000? Is it $75,000, et cetera? What does it cost per acre to maintain the current level of your asset value, the pools, the swing sets, soccer fields, the lights, the bleachers, et cetera? So we get that cost per acre, and that's how we calculate the impact fee. So the math is fairly simple. So impact fees in South Carolina. I did mention that South Carolina has an impact fee act. There's 29 states in the country right now that have impact fee acts. A lot of them have a lot of the same things in there, like, you know, impact fee revenue must be maintained separately in an interest-bearing account. That's pretty standard, right? One of the unique things about South Carolina is it says monies must be spent within 3 years of the scheduled date of construction. And many states, like Arizona, for instance, say you just have 10 years to spend the money. Now, there's been considerable confusion about this in South Carolina, and a lot of folks have thought that this requirement means that if I pay my impact fee today, the county has 3 years to spend my money. No. What it means is if we say we're going to build Road A in 2029, we have to have spent that money by 2032. So that's what that means. Also, the big difference between South Carolina and every other state in the every other impact fee act in the United States is it requires an analysis that estimates the effect of imposing the fee on affordable housing within the county, the district, the city, et cetera. And the act really doesn't define what affordable is. It doesn't prescribe any methods for determining affordability. It doesn't prescribe any sort of amelioration that if you do find, for instance, that, you know, we've typically done this where we sort of use mortgage banking sort of rules where, you know, a household shouldn't be spending more than 1/3 of its income on housing related costs, right? But if we find out that it's 39%, there's nothing in the State Impact Fee Act that says you've got to reduce the fee until it gets down to 33% on average. It just says you have to do an analysis. So there's been a lot of consternation about how you do this analysis. What does this analysis mean? And again, it's the only state in the country that has this requirement. Now, most impact fee acts do limit or define what sorts of infrastructure systems that you can collect impact fees for. Yours is very prescriptive. It defines what, you know, water, wastewater, solid waste, stormwater, public safety, which includes police, fire, and emergency medical services, parks and recreation, libraries, and schools. Other acts like Colorado just says any infrastructure system that the community has to provide to service growth. And so people have taken that to mean that we can do impact fees for affordable housing, we can do affordable or child care, public arts, et cetera. Arizona is very prescriptive. They've outlawed some categories and put limitations on others. So for instance, in Arizona, you can't use impact fees for parks more than 30 acres in size. You can't use it for public safety training facilities. So all these acts have different requirements and define which infrastructure categories you can typically use the fees for. Yes, sir. Sure. Yep. Yep. Staff already has this. They can distribute this as they want. One of the things we have to do with impact fees is we have to guard against new development paying twice. And that's why we use the term credits or offsets. And the first two the last two I'm going to talk about first. And these are sort of, for lack of a better term, they're baked into the numbers already. So the idea here is that if I pay you an impact fee, there's a chance I may generate other revenues, whether it's property tax or sales tax, for instance, that you may use for the same thing that I just provided or paid an impact fee for. So we have to discount the impact fee for that future stream of revenue. So those types of credits have to do with, for instance, if you've got existing debt on, let's say, parks and recreation facilities, we probably are going to have to issue a credit. Or if we're using a plan-based approach for fees, and I'll get into methodologies here in a second, and you're going to issue debt in the future, we're probably going to have to give a credit because you're going to pay the impact fee, but you're also going to pay property or sales tax that goes to retire that debt. Also, in situations where jurisdictions have dedicated revenues, again, typically it's property tax, sales tax, that is going toward a certain infrastructure category, there's a good chance we're going to have to give a credit, particularly if these funds are commingled. And I'll give you an example. So when we did the road fee in Beaufort County, and for York County, but York County didn't adopt, we had two pots of money. There were the road projects that sales tax was going to fund, and then there were the other projects that impact fees were going to fund. In that instance, we don't have to give a credit because we haven't commingled that money, right? But if we're just saying, hey, here's our $100 million road CIP, and we're going to fund it through impact fees and sales tax, well, we're going to have to give a credit, right? Because we're commingling these funds. Now, the top credit, the site-specific, this is usually prescribed in your ordinance or the resolution that adopts the fee, because there may be situations, and this happens all the time, where, for instance, a developer gives you land for a fire station, and there is land in the fire impact fee calculation, right? So the development agreement is executed where the developer is made whole through either future impact fee credits or a future stream of revenue that is given to them over time until they're made whole. Again, that's not baked into the methodology. That would be in the ordinance that implements the fees. So the fee schedule itself, as I mentioned, implemented by ordinance or resolution. It's the mechanism for determining the cost to be recovered from new development. It shows you how the fees are assessed. For instance, in this case, single family, multifamily for residential. We had retail, office, industrial, institutional uses, and hotels. I think this is from Moncks Corner, South Carolina. The fees are typically in constant dollars. One of the things that the ordinance or resolutions in some communities, they'll have a mechanism in it, because typically most jurisdictions that are growing fast, they typically update their impact fees every 5 years or so, because it's sort of the horizon of your CIP. But what do you do about those interim years, right? You've got inflation. So a lot of jurisdictions will have a mechanism in the ordinance where, for instance, every July 1st, if that's when your fiscal year starts, the fees are inflated based on some sort of standard indexing like the Engineering News and Record Price Index. So if materials went up 3.5% in this year, the fees just go up 3.5% automatically, and that sort of helps you keep up to speed with inflation over those years between fee studies itself. I mentioned that affordable housing analysis, and the reason why I mention this again is because I can't think of a jurisdiction in the country that we're working in that affordable housing isn't a concern, right? Everybody's concerned with the price of housing. And this shows a jurisdiction where the baseline condition is without the impact fee. So we look at the purchase price, the likely down payment, the loan term, interest rates, try to calculate, well, what would you pay on average for property tax? What would you pay for your utility bill, et cetera, in order to get your monthly cost. And then we compare it to, well, what if we implemented the impact fees at 100% of the maximum supportable fees? Sometimes we do scenarios where you do 75 or 50% of the maximum amount to see what the delta is between the scenario without the fees and the scenario with fees. And then we look at, well, what does that mean in terms of your monthly cost burden? And in this case, below 33%. So we figured that, from our perspective, then that's within the range of comfort. Affordable housing can also be addressed through, and I'm assuming I'm going to beat somebody to the punch on a question, because normally after this presentation they say, well, what can we do about affordable housing? Well, you can't typically waive fees and get away with it, so to speak. When we waive impact fees for particular use, when it's to solve some sort of policy goal that we have, either economic development or affordable housing, et cetera, generally you have to make up the difference. So if we waive $500,000 in fees, we have to find $500,000 from the general fund or some other source to make the impact fee CIP whole. Now, there are ways that through the methodology itself, you can make fees more affordable. And one of the things that we've been doing around the country for the last 20 years is doing fees by size of house. And so, most communities we work with, unless you're, in Florida and a, heavily retiree community, typically in most communities, we find that the larger the home, more people reside there, they have more vehicles available to them, which influences the trip generation rates. And so smaller homes will pay a lower fee, and they usually smaller homes cost less. So it helps with housing affordability, but it also improves proportionality. Proportionality, if you remember, is linking the demand from a particular land use with how much infrastructure they're consuming. And so in most communities, the leveling off point. So eventually there's this relationship between size and the number of people, but then it starts to level off at some point. And sometimes in one community that may be 3,500 square feet and maybe 5,000 square feet in another community. And so you cap it, and at this point it's capped at 2,400. But you can see here, we've looked at, and we can plug the vehicles available and the persons per unit into the Institute of Transportation Engineer formula and get customized trip generation rates, not only by community, but also by size of house. And you can see here that the smaller homes, which typically would be an apartment, are generating 2.6 trips, and the largest single family category is generating 9.68 trips, right? So that helps with housing affordability through the fee schedule or the fee calculations itself. Now, I did mention methodologies, and the way to think about this is the past, the present, and the future. So when we look to the past, that's where a jurisdiction, whether through foresight or accident, doesn't matter, you have excess capacity within your infrastructure, okay? And so new growth buys into that, and it's commonly used for things like utilities. So if you have a 10 million gallon a day wastewater treatment plant and the current flow is 6 million gallons a day, we're going to figure out, well, what it costs you per gallon to build that plant. And then new growth is going to buy into that remaining 4 million gallons of capacity. We can also do this with other infrastructure, like for instance, jurisdictions that may have built a brand new public safety building 2 years ago and they oversized it because they're going to grow into it for the next 20 years. We'll design a methodology to let you capture new development's share of that debt service that you have on that facility. When we look to the present, and this is by far the most common method for calculating fees, it's very formulaic. It's kind of what I went over earlier in that math slide, where you document levels of service in quantitative measures, such as number of park acres per person, number of, what's your volume to capacity ratios on your road network. And then we figure out, well, what does it cost us to replicate that infrastructure going forward? And then finally, when you look to the future, we call that a plan-based approach. Very common with utilities, very common with roads. Typically, we want to see an adopted master plan, and more importantly, an adopted funding strategy with that. Because generally, when you do a plan-based approach, that plan is designed to elevate the level of service in the community. And one of the things we haven't talked about is that you can't use impact fees to correct existing deficiencies. So if you remember when we talked about the math slide, I said the adopted level of service in the park master plan may be 5 acres per thousand, but you're at 3.6. Well, we can't charge for the 5.0 or the 5 acres per person unless we've identified some funding source, which some jurisdictions do. They go out to the voters and get a sales tax, and they say, we're going to elevate the level of service with the sales tax, and new development's going to pay the impact fee based on the 5 acres per thousand. So we have to identify the growth and the non-growth shares. And that can get you in trouble sometimes, because if we've done this calculation and we say, hey, we're going to build this $30 million Parks and Rec CIP, and we're counting on $18 million in impact fee and $12 million from other sources, and there's a recession and you only get $8 million in impact fees, now you got to come up with $22 million from the other sources. With that incremental expansion method, there is no growth share, because the level of service is what the level of service is, right? We're not looking at elevating the level of service. So with this method, there's less general fund exposure. And if growth is faster, you generate more money and you build more infrastructure. If growth is slower, well, there's just not as much demand for park infrastructure. So instead of building 15 new acres of park, you're going to build 7. So basically, you have to spend to the level of the impact fees you collected. So it offers sort of maximum flexibility. Now, myths and misconceptions. The big one is that I can't tell you how many jurisdictions I've worked with who think that if you adopt impact fees, it's going to be the silver bullet or panacea that solves all of your infrastructure problems. And that's simply not the case. A properly designed fee may come close to funding the growth-related needs. But remember, our CIP has all sorts of needs in there. It has needs where we're trying to increase levels of service. It has infrastructure replacement, roof repairs, et cetera. Also, what if we have to give credits, right? That's going to reduce the fee amount. And then more importantly, most jurisdictions we work with, the capital budget is 15 to 25% of your total budget. The real cost is the operating cost. And so what we found, for instance, with parks, I love using parks as an example, after the Great Recession was a lot of cities we worked with sort of held back and said, you know what? I think our priority, because of our operating budget, is going to be, we're just going to build new amenities. We're not going to purchase additional parkland, because that means we're going to have to maintain it. So a lot of jurisdictions eliminated the land component of their impact fee and just concentrated on getting money to build new baseball facilities, swing sets, et cetera, because of those operating costs. We've already covered the second point, which is the example I gave about 5 acres per thousand versus 3.6. Impact fees should be based on planning standards without concern for deficiencies. No, that's what gets jurisdictions sued, gets them in trouble. Also, we have this little thing called equal protection in the United States. And so most impact fee attorneys, most impact fee practitioners would argue that we just can't arbitrarily waive fees or discriminate against land uses. So we work with a lot of jurisdictions that say, hey, can we only charge residential impact fees? We don't want to charge retail because it generates so much sales tax. Well, no, we can't discriminate against land uses, right? Now, there are opportunities or things that present themselves, and I sort of touched on this earlier about housing affordability or economic development, where if you have a policy that's in your comprehensive plan or strategic plan or some other plan like an economic development strategy or et cetera, where, for instance, Colorado Springs, where we're working, they're trying to incentivize non-basic employment. So if they decided to say, hey, we're going to waive impact fees for non-basic employment generating uses, well, that's fine, but they have to find another revenue source to make the program whole. So, but we just can't simply say, we're just going to charge residential but not non-residential or vice versa. Another misconception that we've run into is that all developers and builders hate impact fees. That's simply not true. It's not been my experience. A lot of, I'd say the smart developers understand impact fees, understand why we have them. They just want to make sure that they're above board, the methodology is sound, the assumptions are sound. But so we have not had that experience. Now, we do get into some spirited debates sometimes as part of our outreach, and we always encourage our clients to have a stakeholder committee with various interests, including Chamber of Commerce, the home builders, developers, concerned citizens, et cetera. But that is simply a myth from our perception. We've sort of talked about this. Impact fees negatively affect low to moderate income housing. They don't have to, and it is true that, for instance, if it costs $300,000 today to build a house in Greenville County, and the county were to implement an impact fee program that, let's say, was $10,000, yeah, price of housing is probably going to be $310,000, right? The fee gets passed on. And in our experience, in a robust economic situation, 100% of that $10,000 gets passed on, sometimes more, because the developer has carrying costs, right? But when we're in a soft market, it's a little more complicated. So, for instance, the farmer who sells the 2,000-acre farm takes less money per acre. The developer takes a hit in the pocketbook in terms of the profit. The homeowner absorbs a portion of that, right? But we've talked about ways that we can sort of mitigate this. One is through the progressive impact fee structure. Also, if you established a policy as a county that says, hey, this is what we're going to call affordable or workforce housing, this is what we're going to incentivize, and we've found a pot of money that can help us with that. There are ways that we can mitigate the impacts on really affordable or workforce types of units. So the process is very straightforward, no matter what state you're in. First part is, as part of establishing that nexus, we have to figure out, well, what's the residential and non-residential demand base in Greenville County? We have to document that. And then we also have to make a projection of, well, what's the likely growth over the next 10 or 12 years? And so there's various ways we do that. You look at past building permit history, you look at developments in the pipeline. Some places rely on their council of government. So for instance, we work for just about every suburb in the Phoenix area. Everybody there relies on the Maricopa Association of Governments to do their projections for them. And so every impact fee study, it's just, well, we use the MAG data, so that makes our job easy, right? Then we have usually 2 rounds of interviews with the different service providers to talk about existing levels of service, gather data, talk about capital needs due to new growth. A lot of times we'll prepare the fee using 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 of those different methodologies we talked about. And sometimes it could be a combination within one category. So for instance, again, I'll use parks. We may be using a consumption-based or incremental expansion approach for parkland and park improvements, but the community just built a one-of aquatic center, right? Well, we may do a cost recovery or buy-in for the aquatic center along with the consumption-based method for land and improvements. We have to evaluate the need for credits, calculate the fees, evaluate the impact on affordable housing. Then again, we're big believers in the stakeholder outreach. We do all of that before meeting with the Planning Commission, and that's another vagary of the South Carolina Impact Fee Act. It's the only act in the country that the Planning Commission has to pass a resolution well, first of all, they have to pass a resolution saying do the study. Then they have to pass a resolution to forward the study onto the elected body. Again, the only state in the country, but it does make sense because a lot of communities forget, they kind of think of impact fees as a revenue source, but actually impact fees are a land use regulation. So it kind of makes sense that it goes through the Planning Commission. And then the adoption process, it begins, and your adoption process is pretty streamlined. I can tell you in Arizona, from the day you start the process, it's 225 days minimum to go from the first public notice to adoption. So it takes almost a year and a half to do an impact fee study there. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I know that was a lot.
I'll open this up, obviously, with what you mentioned with the Planning Commission study is a huge first step in that, and that's why we wanted to make sure to have all of us here today. I'll just ask the question, but obviously it'd be what specific things will the planning commission need to be prepared to undertake to conduct the study? Is there a format for that, or is?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. They just passed the resolution, saying let's do the study, and then they're just a review body where we typically sometimes do a work session with them, then a public hearing where they pass the resolution. But it's sort of like this, where you sort of do an impact fee 101 if they haven't heard anything about impact fees, because frankly, we've been in front of a few of these where everybody's sort of scratching their heads saying, "Oh, what are we doing? What's our role in this process?" Right? Because they haven't been involved from the beginning, like you've done here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. What is the average cost of a study? And then I guess maybe for council to consider, and where would that money come from?
Right. Good question. It really depends. Two things. One, the size of the jurisdiction, and two, the number of fee categories that you're going to include. So for instance, typically the hierarchy of costs are utilities and roads are the most expensive impact fees, followed by parks, followed by fire, then police, general government, et cetera. But most of the cities that we've been doing in South Carolina is less than 100K, usually the 60 to 80 range. Horry County and Beaufort County were, I think, 200 plus. Some counties have been 100, some 150. It just depends on how many fees. Yeah.
While I have the mic, of the communities you've worked with, can you give us an example of one where this wasn't successful?
Yeah, I guess that's thanks for putting me on the spot. So I guess to define what's successful. I define it as, some jurisdictions just politically don't have the will to go forward. And for instance, that was the case when we did York County a few years ago. And I've talked to staff recently, and there's rumblings that they may want to resurrect it. Right? Beaufort County has been very successful. Horry County. They have chosen only to adopt certain fees and not others because of their perceived impact on economic development, right? So I guess it really depends on how you define success, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll go ahead with mine.
Okay.
It's similar to what Ms. Seaman asked. When you've dealt with entities in South Carolina and you found that a municipality, for instance, or a county decided that they did not want to go with the impact fee after they implemented it, how long would you say they would come back and with that kind of decision?
I think I understood the question. Did you say a city implements an impact fee but then changes their mind 6 months later and says we don't want to have it anymore?
I'm asking, is it 6 months, a year, 2
I
years?
don't know.
What have you experienced?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I haven't experienced that with any of our clients in South Carolina. I can tell you that during the Great Recession, we had several clients, particularly in Florida, not anywhere else, where they put in, impact fee moratoriums or suspended impact fees in an effort to, thinking that was going to spur development when, really it was a bigger economic structural problem we had in the country at that point, right? And those jurisdictions that suspended fees didn't see any uptick in development, right? So those are the examples I know of. I don't know of any jurisdiction that we've worked with that anywhere in the country actually where they've adopted impact fees but then had misgivings 6 months later or a year later.
So similar question. Hardly no one, if anyone that you know of, has done the study and then decided not to go forward with impact.
No, there have been some of those.
What kind of proportion? That
From those, it's probably 10, 15%. Yeah, there's not very many have decided not to go forward, and if they do, there's some sort of compelling reason, like for instance, they've got a sales tax referendum on the horizon, and they said we're just going to fund everything through sales tax, right? But a lot of jurisdictions do say, well, we're not going to adopt 100% of the amounts, right? Or they phase the fees in also. That's an important qualifier, and I think a fair way to do things too, because if I'm a developer and I'm in the process of getting my financing in order for a project that I'm going to break ground in a year, my financing right now doesn't have an assumption that I'm going to have a cost of, let's say, $10,000 for impact fees, right? So a lot of jurisdictions will, when they implement the fees, do a phase in over time to get the fees up to the 100%.
Based on the growth rate here in Greenville County, obviously you wouldn't be here if you didn't think we needed it. Do we need impact fees?
That's something I can't answer. That's.
Can you give us a hint?
I would say that if you're like most fast-growing southern counties that we work with, you're finding it harder and harder to fund growth-related infrastructure.
Are we one of the fastest growing counties in the state?
I believe you are one of the faster ones.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
How often are counties challenged legally when they're implementing impact?
Good question. Good question. Not as often as you would think. Usually there's something. Like for instance, Fort Mill was challenged with the school impact fee, and we did the school impact fee. And the reason it was challenged, it was the first one, and it was so expensive, right? And they lost, or the home builders lost, and then appealed and lost again. Usually, it's not that often, and usually it's because there's a flaw in the methodology, something that's been done that's somewhat egregious, right? But that doesn't stop frivolous lawsuits, right? But most jurisdictions, if they go through a process, that's again one of the reasons why you want to do public outreach, so that everything is out in the open, everybody has comfort in terms of the approach, right? So it's not as often as a lot of people think.
Kind of going off of that, if there's any advice you could give to the planning commission or the study to get that prepared, if that were to go forward, are there any practices we would need to do to ensure that we would have less likelihood of any kind of lawsuit?
Great question. Yeah. To me, I would strongly encourage that you get the jurisdictions involved, and because there are certain infrastructure categories that you are providing that are unincorporated in nature, like for instance law enforcement patrol is particularly usually done in the unincorporated areas, right? But other infrastructure may be being provided countywide, and so you want to get interlocal agreements with the communities for not all the fees, but some of the fees where the city should be paying, because otherwise you've got a hole in the donut, so to speak, from a funding perspective, right? Sometimes that can get jurisdictions into legal problems where they're not building the infrastructure they should because they said, well, we didn't get the money from the cities, right? Well, you were never going to get the money for the cities, right? You were going to have to find another revenue source.
So if we have a subdivision that's before us in the planning commission, and we find that we're not able to look at the roads and really say the roads are too skinny or what have you, but if in fact the roads are too narrow and there is some concerns with getting fire and emergency vehicles in and out of a specific subdivision, can we use the impact fees to be able to expand that roadway?
Well, good question. You can't use fire impact fees to do that. You may be able to use road impact fees, depending on what approach you took, what roads you included, etc.
And we would then designate that to the developer. These are the road impact fees. Is that what we
Right. Whoever. Well, we sort of use this term developer interchangeably, right? It's whoever pulls the building permit. So usually it's the home builder that is paying the fee. Sometimes the developer is the home builder, right? Sometimes the developer is just laying the infrastructure and selling the lots to individual home builders. So we sort of use developer as this sort of catch-all, but it's really whoever pulls the building permit would pay the impact fee.
So
that home, that
That
whoever
particular
pulled.
homeowner?
Yep.
Got it. Thank you. Couple questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So the impact fee study, does that require us to look at all the data for every possibility that we want to use impact fees? I mean, is there, or say we want to go and use impact fees for roads, infrastructure?
Right.
Or, transportation. Do we only have to focus on that, or do we have to do a very broad?
You have the ability to choose which categories you want to consider. So, for instance, a lot of jurisdictions will say, hey, we want to do police, fire, transportation, fire EMS, and stormwater. But then you get into the study and you figure out, well, 95% of all your needs for stormwater are a result of sins of the past, right? Inadequate regulations, and if you shut the doors tomorrow, never let a new house in, you'd still have all those stormwater problems, right? So in our experience, stormwater doesn't lend itself well to an impact fee in most communities because a stormwater utility is a much better option, right? So you may find out that, it doesn't make sense to do stormwater, or you may find out that, like, we just did a fee in Grand Junction, Colorado, where there was a real debate of, we passed a public safety sales tax, and because of the credits we had to give, the police impact fee was $400, right? And so is it really worth it? Are we better off focusing on roads, parks and recreation, which is where our real demands are, because they already found a funding source for parks or police and fire. So a lot of times that's what a jurisdiction weighs when they're thinking about what fees to adopt.
So these are things we need to consider before we even begin.
Right.
And I understand the purpose of impact fees and the advantages. I also understand that they're not going to change all the past conglomeration. What are your thoughts about regulation changes and amendments that incorporate some stricter requirements in development when it happens versus impact fee?
I think I understand the question, but I mean, as I understand what you just said, the problem is going to be that, as I understand it, you're legally limited to the types of things that you would exact or require through regulation, and it's not getting the bigger system-wide things, right? It's things that are specific to that project or that area, which isn't solving the fact that you need to build an athletic complex or you need to build a major arterial three miles away, right?
What is the process? We start a year, 18 months down the road with public safety, parks, some affordable housing, and then as it evolves, what is the process to add things later on? Is it the same lengthy process?
Yeah, but depends on the fees. So, like I said, transportation utilities take more time, they're harder to do. But yeah, there's jurisdictions that, for instance, have just started out with a transportation impact fee and then decided 5 years later, hey, we want to do parks and public safety, right? It's just a matter of how long it takes to do the study. I mean, you can do police and fire much quicker than you can do the others. So it may be 3 months to do that when the other study took 6 or 8 months, right?
And do you have to go back through the same process with public
Yes.
Meetings,
Right.
hearings, that sort of thing?
You do.
And would the planning commission sort of oversee that? Would
Yes,
that be-
they would have to go through the same process where the planning commission would do a resolution to say, hey, we need to commission a parks and public safety impact fee study. But the good news is you're not Arizona. It's not like you have to wait 225 days after you finish the study to adopt them, right? I think it's like 60 days or something. So
So is it something that potentially, since the planning commission conducts the study, whether they go through all the possible variables, and then they deliver back to council what they feel like impact fees would need to be applied to it, or is there a collaboration there?
Well, I'll give you an option. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll get hired to basically do a feasibility study where Like we did this for Richland County one time, or just one time 15 years ago, and then just this past year, where we looked at all the different areas that they were thinking about doing impact fees. And it's basically a white paper. It costs like $5,500. Where I flew down there, talked to everybody, and based on those conversations, we said it makes sense to do 5 of these 8 impact fees. And so it saves you money in the long run, because otherwise they may have said, hey, we want to do all 8 impact fees, and then they paid money to do them and they don't end up implementing them. So that's always an option as well.
So we have a bunch of sub-fire districts around here.
Right.
How do you make sure that the impact fees are going towards those jurisdictions?
Yeah, we had the same situation in Beaufort. So you have to, each fire district would have its own impact fee, and each fire district essentially is its own service area. Yeah.
Thank you for,
Yeah.
apologize for.
Oh, it's all right.
At the beginning. Can you go over again, a big part of what you talked about was affordable housing, and in that, are you talking about the affordability of starter homes? But my bigger question is, were you saying that the strategy there, if impact fees are enacted, is to give credits on outside of the impact fee, because the impact fee can't take into, you seem to say that the impact fee could take into affordable housing into a progressive fee or something.
So one way you can make fees more affordable for affordable units is if you do that progressive residential fee schedule, because the lower cost units typically have fewer people. So they're not paying sort of the one size fits all fee. Let's say the single family fee is $5,000, let's say, right? On average, if you did it the one size fits all. But if we did a progressive fee structure, the average house is paying $5,000. Let's say that's the 2,500 square foot house, but the 1,200 square foot house is paying, $3,200. Right? So it's sort of baked in that it makes it more affordable. That's not the same as saying we have a policy that, this is what an affordable unit is, and we define it, and this is what we're going to do to incentivize that. That's completely different, right? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So as a follow-up to Mr. Farmer's question, what happens to utilities that charge hookup fees? So do they give impact fee on top of their connection fees, or how does that scenario?
Yeah, so, and I'm not sure how it's done in Greenville County, but a lot of counties have sewer authorities or multiple entities that provide utilities. And they sometimes have their own charge, what they call it. Sometimes it's a benefit charge, a connection charge, a tap fee, et cetera. But most of the time it's just an impact fee, essentially, but they call it something else. Yeah, you would still have to pay the utilities as well as the county. Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
If we do impact fees, and I appreciate the information with regards to impact fees, you have to be on the equal protection side across the board. Kind of was under the impression that it would be just new single-family homes. Okay, so that could have a negative impact on economic growth, recruiting new industry, that kind of thing. That's not my question. If you do impact fees, and say you add an average of $10,000 to every house, which you pretty much said it gets passed on to the buyer. Though, if somebody does an appraisal on Miss Smith across the street, whose house has been there 20 years, the increased price of the house due to the impact fee gets calculated in on the appraisal across the street. Fast forward though, when the county comes around every 5 years to do reassessment, would those new extra add-ons be calculated into reassessment pricing, which could indirectly be a backdoor tax increase to the people we're supposedly trying to protect?
I'm afraid I do not have any empirical data on that because I'm not an assessor.
It comes up in continuing education
Okay.
with real estate licenses.
Okay.
But does the impact fee actually raise the value of the home? Is it even calculated in that?
My opinion is it probably does. If you built a $300,000 house a year ago, and there's a $300,000 house built today across the street that has a $10,000 impact fee, my my gut tells me that the value of the house across the street has gone up.
And that extra $10,000 is going on to the sales price of the home, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And if they have a loan, it's actually then amortized over the
Right.
time of the loan.
And I
Is that
should have,
correct?
yes, and so that's a great point. I don't mean to denigrate or be facetious about the impact of the fees on housing prices, because as I said, they do get passed on, right? But I can tell you, I mean, I'm ballparking the numbers here, but when we did York School District 1's fees, it took about a year of politicking to get them passed, or to get to the process. But during that period, the interest rate went from 3 to like 7%. And so this was a proposed like $15,000 impact fee. And when which, you know, most cities we're working with, they're not anywhere near $15,000, right? But this $15,000,
What was the sales price of the home?
I can't remember. But what the real key is, it doesn't matter what the sales price is, what does it add to the mortgage?
Right.
And so the $15,000 was like $37, right?
$37
Yeah, but then by the end of it,
Is that
then,
correct?
yeah, $37 a month. But then by the, you know, when the interest rate went up, it was like $77 or $97, something like that, right? But that's one of the ways we show the data. We show it not by, or we show it by what does it add to the percentage of average income, or your monthly income that goes to housing. But we also show it at different mortgage interest rates to give us some context, right? Because a lot of times you hear a lot of misinformation. Like I've been in meetings where someone says, well, for every $30 of impact fee, you've priced 3,000 people out of, or 3,000 families out of the housing market. And you're like, really, $30? That's $1.75 in your mortgage? Doesn't pass the sniff test, right?
And oftentimes builders will go ahead and give interest rate incentives to a buyer,
Maybe.
which can actually be used against the
But
loan.
yeah, but it is, it's a real concern, and I think that the fact that the South Carolina Impact Fee Act has that provision in there has really been helpful, because it sort of fosters a bigger discussion about housing affordability. Yes, sir.
A little bit that I read on impact fees, when a developer is getting ready to purchase a piece of property and we have the impact fee in place, they will base their price on that property with the impact fee already digested in their proposed price. Therefore, when they buy the property, the owner will not get as much money, and then, so I guess I'm saying the whole impact fee is not gonna be passed on 100% to the homeowner. The studies I've seen is that the developer, and what they're doing now, they're coming in and giving arm and a leg for each property. Now they know they gotta pay, if it's $100,000 or $10,000, they know they got $1 million, they gotta get less for the property so they can make their profit.
I mean, I guess that depends on the situation, because if you're the developer only, you're not going to be paying an impact fee because you're going to sell the lots, right? It's the builder, right? So, yeah, it just depends on the situation, whether you have the developer only or the developer is the home builder as well.
So in that scenario, the land sellers carry
Well, not all of them, they carry some of them. They give them $1 million, they get $995,000, they carry 0.5%. I'm just saying that is reality. If I'm buying something and I know I got more money I want to pay out for every dollar I put, my offer is going to be lower.
So the land seller, I'm paying the tax to sell my property.
Yeah.
Dollar tax.
All of that.
Dollar tax.
Versus the homeowner, the new buyer.
All of that.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen where the county implements impact fees and home builders and developers end up just moving on over to the next county?
I've not seen that.
You wouldn't be that lucky.
I will just mean this. We could sit here for hours and talk about the impact on economic development, but all I can tell you is I think we've got over 90 active impact fee jobs right now, and I think over 60 of those are repeat clients, and they've been multiple repeat clients. So they wouldn't keep going to the well if impact fees were making development go elsewhere.
Do you have data
Oh, yeah. So I mentioned every now and then this comes up. Like in Grand Junction, I mentioned we just finished a fee study. And the fees were going up significantly. And there was reason for that. And we showed that after the last impact fee study, building permit activity actually increased over what it was before they implemented the impact fees. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, I've been doing this 30 years, almost 35 years. There's a reason people want to live in your community. There's a reason businesses want to locate in your community. And they vary, it could be educated workforce, it could be transportation advantages, it could be quality of life. There's a reason people want to locate in communities. And because you've implemented impact fees, doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to be a ghost town.
And you're saying that you've seen in Grand Junction, Colorado, an increase in the number of building permits because of impact?
No, not because of impact fees. It was just what happened, right? And it's just not Grand Junction. It's other communities as well. Queen Creek, Arizona. Oh, I mean, first of all, we don't do that often, but every now and then when someone's got an axe to grind, we'll go back, well, let's see what happens at the last impact fee study, right? But it happens frequently. But I can't tell you of anywhere all of a sudden, because of impact fees, somebody goes from 800 housing units to 400 housing units. When something like that happens, it's because there's something else going on, and everybody has experienced that, right? Could be interest rates, could be a recession.
Number 10 county upstate region, can you tell us who all currently has impact fees, either counties or municipalities?
I can take a stab at it. So we've done fees in Inman, Clinton, Fountain Inn, Easley, Greer, where else? Do you consider Lexington part of that 10? Lexington County, Lancaster County, Lancaster County Schools. I know I'm missing one or two. No, I think they just. Yeah. I don't know if Spartanburg does. There's a few others I'm blanking on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would you go back to your slide, the 3 methodology slide?
Yeah. There.
Correct. Okay, so am I to understand, say, in our county, our roads are horrible, that we can only, that if we did cost recovery, would we be able to go back and, you're saying for facilities or debt service, we wouldn't be able to go and say, expand those roads, like if, say, Woodruff Road, or, we would expand the full lanes all the way. I mean, just putting stuff out there, but would they be able to, or fix a road that is obviously too small, but it's now we're putting another 500 houses on it, so would that say that new 500 houses is actually impacting that road, so yes, we can go back and fix it? I'm a little bit confused
So
about
that example, you could fund those kind of roads with either this or this. This you don't see very often with roads. This is more for utilities, or like you just built your last fire station, right? It depends on the method, but yes, if for instance, if we did a plan-based approach and the road you're talking about, Woodruff Road, was on the CIP that the fees were based on, then that's an eligible expenditure. If we do that incremental expansion, it'll basically just say, we'll build an aggregate demand model, and it'll say, okay, based on your road network and your level of service, over the next 10 years, you'd have to build 15 lane miles, right? For instance. And then we would show a list of, let's say, 30 lane miles of possible projects, and you would just have to pick 15 lane miles. And if Woodruff Road happened to be going from a 2-lane to a 4-lane, those 2 new lanes would be impact fee eligible.
Question for, I guess it would be a public service, public safety, fire, police, EMS. You can build fire stations, EMS stations, sheriff's department substations. I'm assuming with this money, you could buy equipment.
As long as it has a value of $100,000.
Okay.
So police cars are off the table.
That's not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. What about personnel?
Nope.
You cannot finance the resources for personnel with this money.
No,
Only
no, sir.
the property and
Right.
the equipment,
Mm-hmm.
which would be fire trucks, ambulances, probably not patrol cars. Has
Right.
100,000.
Yeah.
And, fire truck and an ambulance definitely.
And I think there's also a 10-year useful life requirement in South Carolina also.
So, I wasn't finished.
Yeah.
So, for the CIP, we have to have every project identified prior to implementing the fee, and say, when we implement the fee, it is for these roads here, or these.
Depends on the methodology. So if, in the plan-based methodology, there would probably be a list of here are all the roads, right? And we'll identify, how they're being funded. Like for instance, if you're going to build, let's say, a $20 million road, sometimes you're relying on, let's say, $8 million from the federal government. So the county's net cost is $12 million, right? So all that will be in there. But a plan-based approach typically says we're going to build roads A, B, C, D, and E. That doesn't mean that if, let's say there's a catalytic economic development project that comes in 3 years from now, that all of a sudden your priorities change and you say, well, we don't need to build Smith Road anymore. We've got an adequate substitute that costs just as much. And no, you're not going to get sued over that. If we do the consumption-based approach, you're going to have a little more flexibility. And again, it'll say something like, well, you need to build 20 lane miles over the next 10 years. And then you could have a list of, well, here's the projects that we would cull our 20 lane miles from.
Are grants, can you tie grants to these?
Well, grants would need to be netted out. So a lot of times we work, again, parks seems to be always the best example. Like in Colorado, a lot of the jurisdictions we work with get what's called DOLA grants for parks. So a lot of times they say, yeah, we know we're going to get revenue, we just don't know how much. So we will have overcharged if we say, hey, we're going to build $10 million worth of parks, but you're probably going to get $1 million in grants. So we've overcharged you. So typically what we will do is we'll look at some sort of 5 to 10 year historical cash flow of how much you've gotten in grants to get an average annual, to get an estimate of what we would need to net out to get the city or county's net cost. Does that make sense?
It does. So now with the state gas tax, we get a percentage of that when that changes.
Typically not, because I don't know of any jurisdiction we work with in the country that isn't using gas tax strictly for maintenance.
And would you go to one more slide, your variables slide?
This one?
4 or 5, we'll go back. One more. Go back again. It was one where you showed the multiplication on it.
Ah.
Who comes up with these variables? Who comes up with the constants? Where do they come from?
It's a collaborative effort between our staff and your staff, where we.
Are there any state guidelines, like you have to be based on census numbers, things like that?
Yeah, there are some, well, not guidelines, but best practices, right? You just can't pull a person per household number out of the air, right? You've got to, so we use the latest American Community Survey data. We use employment data typically from Esri. We have a subscription to CoStar, which allows us to figure out what your non-residential base is in terms of square footage, and also developments in the pipeline, which helps us do the projection of future non-residential space, right? And then we use ITE data, or Institute of Transportation Engineers. For utilities, we use some, American Waterworks Association factors. So there's things that are sort of best practices, but the actual coming up with, defining, in this case, 5 acres per 1,000, we're getting documents from you and talking to staff and figuring out what that level of service is, and figuring out, we just don't take it at face value if someone says, well, yeah, it's going to cost us $250,000 an acre. Well, you got to show us the math. I mean, where are you getting that from, right? We got to see what you've spent in the past, what things are being appraised at, et cetera.
And so that would help us actually, if we get challenged in court, best practice, in the whole state,
Right.
what's going on. We're not just putting numbers out there.
Right.
And you guys obviously come up with all the help. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
For a county our size, would we have to hire an administrator to administrate this?
Good question. Don't know. I can tell you that there are large cities and large counties that we work with that do have a dedicated impact fee administrator. So my guess is it probably would add a significant burden, and so you probably would want to hire somebody.
I assume you're familiar with what Fountain Inn, I believe, is
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah, we just finished that.
If you took Fountain Inn's numbers just across the board and applied it to Green County, new homes, apartments, retail, industrial, commercial, do you have any extrapolation on what that would mean in income?
No. are you, well, first I want to clarify, are you asking how much you think that the county could get in impact fee revenue?
Yeah.
No, because you guys are night and day different. Yeah. I think they only adopted, I think we only did 3 fees, and I can't remember if they adopted all 3 or adopted 1 or 2, yeah. So, right. Yeah, I mean, you're talking apples to oranges. I mean, you're a large county with a huge infrastructure asset pool. I mean, I could see what Beaufort and Horry brought in, but I mean, I would guess that it's millions a year.
I guess what I'm trying to get is, Grable County did not vote in a sales tax last year, for instance. And my understanding is $1.2 billion over 7 years, is that? 8 years, is that right?
Right.
So if the expectation is we're gonna replace.
You're not.
that with impact.
You won't. You're not going to generate that much money in 7 years. Right. Yeah, my guess is probably 30 to 40 million, depending on how many impact categories you have. Right. Yeah.
But impact fees do not have to go through a ballot,
They do not.
right?
They do not. Any other questions? My pleasure.
I knew as soon as I looked at it that there's so many working parts that we desperately needed a workshop to even discuss before we got to the potential study. So I think that it's good that it worked out the way that it did. And everybody has enough information to go forward from there to decide where we're going. Thank you again very much.
Yeah, and if you have any other questions you want to pass on to staff, they can forward them to me, and I'm happy to answer.
Dr. Shaw, do you have another question?
Do you do concurrent?
Not really. So we work with an attorney here in South Carolina, Tyson Smith in Charleston, from White and Smith Planning and Law. He's a real concurrency APFO specialist. Sometimes we do support work related to that, and we've also developed models that allow you to project or enter in development proposals, and it sort of figures out what your capacity is going to be in certain years. So we've done that kind of stuff. But I'm not an APFO or concurrency expert by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. If we wanted that, you could.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I believe we were keeping it to the property for this one.
We got some guys from the CRA. I feel like they're a stakeholder in this as well. Would you be willing to entertain questions?
Sure. Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Rob Julian, GCRA, also from the state of Florida, the land of impact. So I'm very familiar with Florida and their impact in the areas. Just a general question, you were bringing up the state law at the very beginning, and if I'm understanding that, it goes through the planning, and then they'll form maybe a committee to ascertain future growth project or a particular project for the impact fees. Is that pretty much how the mechanics will work?
Not to my knowledge. The way I understand it, and the way all the jurisdictions have done it, is the Planning Commission just has to basically recommend and pass a resolution recommending the study. They don't have to form a committee. We've always suggested that the jurisdictions put together a stakeholder committee that we work with as part of the process.
Yeah, and the second part of that question, if they do form a committee, would there be an open forum for people like myself and participate in that?
We certainly encourage that.
Yeah, and again, I've been in the development stage for years down in Florida. We had impact fees.
Right.
No problem.
Right.
But if you ever come across municipalities that would think of it as more like too easy to implement for the impact fees and actually go over on impact fees. I know it's a delicate balance, and where those in the projects
that a question?
Yeah, that's the kind of question you come across.
Yeah, I mean, I've run into jurisdictions that, again, it's that fallacy of they think impact fees are going to fund or be their silver bullet that funds everything, and they become too heavily reliant on it, and a lot of times it gets them in trouble legally because they don't realize that they've got to come, like for instance, they think that the new fire station is going to be funded 100% through impact fees, and the math showed them that it was never going to be funded 100% through impact fees, and they don't spend the money because they've been waiting to get enough money to pay 100% for the impact fee, right? So jurisdictions, and they're typically smaller jurisdictions, a little less sophisticated, but that's been our experience.
Yeah, one more final question, I do appreciate it. Have you come across municipalities, whether it's in Colorado or Florida, et cetera, that have actually used part of these impact fees, i.e. like a traffic impact fee, or determine a project where you could basically use part of those impact fees for seed money for startups for more affordable housing, that sort of thing?
I'm not.
Not a particular project, but over a general project.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You would use the fees themselves for affordable housing?
Not directly. I'm talking about indirectly. In cases that I think I've seen before, and I might be wrong, where they would have an impact fee, we'll just say, i.e. traffic impact fee, like
Okay.
$1,200, et cetera. And on the 6,000 units, that's like $7 million bucks. But they would basically use part of that, okay, as seed money for future land purchase or infrastructure purchases or infrastructure build out for more affordable type housing.
No, because if you collected the impact fee specific to transportation, you would need to spend it on transportation-related infrastructure, not a land purchase that's not transportation-related.
Designated strictly.
Right, right.
Right, that's what I was wondering, because I thought I heard it in one of the other states that were trying to do that.
Says you can't do it in South Carolina. Right.
9 pages long.
Yeah. Normally, I've seen jurisdictions use tax increment financing districts to do that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And there's the potential, I guess, that to kind of answer that, maybe that some other states might have different laws than South Carolina does.
Well, not when it comes to, if you collect a fire impact fee, you got to use it for fire, right? That's pretty standard regardless of state, right?
Just real quick, Mr. Chairman, since we have 6 of the planning commission members here, I think, at least from my perspective, is that this isn't going to solve all our problems. It's not the ibuprofen that takes away the pain, but it is part of the solution, and it's using multiple tool knobs to go ahead and make a difference. Is it going to solve every problem, fix every road, or fix everything? No, it's not. I think all my colleagues. But as we grow and how we continue to grow, we need to use all the tools we have in the county that are available to us in state law to lessen the impact. So I ask the 6 of you that are here, is consider that and take that as a members. We're not looking for the silver bullet, we're looking to use another tool we have in state law. Okay? So thank you for that.
And to that, is there a way, I don't know if this would be allowed as part of the study, but is there a way to assess, based over the past maybe 10 years, with the absence of impact fees, how much property tax money to the county has had to go to address infrastructure issues as development has happened? Kind of get a comparison of what all the taxpayers all over the county are spending in these areas versus dedicated amounts from the people that are going to be buying those homes. Is that something that could be included in a study?
Yeah, that'd be fairly simple. I would think it'd be fairly simple to talk to the budget folks.
I want to see data on the growth rates and land usage rates, the changes, how much is covered up with roads, concrete, and asphalt, shingles now versus what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. Because it affects so many. We don't have any of that data that I'm aware of right now, at least publicly facing.
I just think it'd be a good testament to the conversation about the fees, is if the people, like you said, the impact fees force it to cover the cost
Yeah, I don't think you have to go through planning commission to do that. But I'd check with your attorney just to be safe, because
And one last thing, just to be clear, because you mentioned it a couple times, and this might be something that somebody in the back of the room could address too, but we currently have the potential resolution to conduct the impact fee studies, and it's at council. When you mentioned the planning commission passing that,
I think that's the way it goes, yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we were doing it the right way, if that was the case, but I believe it says that council passes a resolution for the planning commission to begin the study. Is that what you did? Did you have that in there?
Directing the local planning.
The governing body of the governmental entity.
Yeah, you enact the resolution.
And I'll double check, I just want to.
Yeah, you may be right. I know they mentioned the planning commission when you conduct the study, so. Yeah.
Thank you again very much.
My pleasure.